Ethan never expected a single sentence to shatter everything, yet those cold words cut deeper than any wound he'd known. He stood there frozen, realizing the person beside him cared more about her weekend plans than the fatting life of his mother. The air felt heavier as her voice stayed sharp and selfish, turning his grief into an inconvenience she refused to tolerate. He tried to breathe, but every second exposed a truth he had ignored for far too long about who she truly was. Her indifference wrapped around him like ice, pushing him toward a decision he had feared but now couldn't avoid anymore. In that quiet moment, Ethan understood that love meant nothing to someone who placed her happiness above the suffering of others. And from that single realization, a chain of events began, messy, explosive, and impossible to reverse. Ethan received the call on a gray Thursday morning, and the world around him seemed to stop breathing. The doctor's voice was steady but heavy, delivering the words he had feared for months, yet still wasn't ready to hear. His mother's cancer had reached its final stage, and there was nothing left to fight with except time slipping away. Ethan held the phone tightly, as if gripping it harder could change the truth echoing on the line. His chest tightened, and for a moment he forgot how to speak because grief had already taken the air from him. He sat down on the edge of his bed, feeling the room tilt as every memory of his mother rushed back at once. He thought of her warm laugh, her small hands fixing his collar on his first school day, her strength through every hardship. A part of him wanted to break, to let the pain crash into him without resistance, but he swallowed it down. He needed to be strong for her now, even though his heart felt like it was splitting open. When he walked into the living room, Melissa was already scrolling on her phone, excited about her birthday trip to Miami. She didn't look up when he walked in, humming to herself as she planned outfits and searched for resorts. Ethan stood there silently, unsure how to start a conversation that would change everything about their weekend. He finally whispered that he had spoken to the doctor, but Melissa simply asked if he wanted to pack early for the trip. Her voice was light and cheerful, completely disconnected from the storm tearing him apart inside. He tried again, this time explaining the diagnosis, trying to let her see the weight he was struggling to carry. Melissa blinked slowly and sighed as if he had interrupted something important she didn't want to pause. She told him the news was sad, but reminded him that they had already booked everything and couldn't cancel now. Ethan felt the floor shift beneath him as he listened to her speak with the same tone she used for minor inconveniences. He stared at her, searching for a flicker of empathy, but her eyes didn't soften and her expression didn't change. She walked around the apartment gathering her makeup bags while telling him to stay positive and not ruin the vibe. The words stung more than she noticed because she didn't even look at him as she said them. Ethan followed her into the kitchen, trying to explain he needed time to process the news before thinking about the trip. Melissa waved her hand dismissively and reminded him that this weekend was about her, and she wanted it perfect. She complained that he had been distant lately and suggested he was overreacting because stress made him dramatic. He felt his throat tighten again, but this time not only from sadness. There was something else growing, something sharp. He realized she had no intention of understanding him and no desire to share the burden he was carrying. The silence between them thickened, stretching wider with every careless word she tossed over her shoulder. Ethan stepped back and watched her pack, wondering how long he had ignored the truth about the woman he loved. He touched his phone again, seeing the missed message from the hospital, and knew that his priorities had shifted forever. As Melissa kept talking about beaches and parties, Ethan felt the first cracks forming in the foundation of their life together. He didn't speak again, but the decision taking shape in his heart was already beginning to change everything. Ethan barely slept that night, replaying every word Melissa had said as the weight of reality pressed on his chest. He stared at the ceiling, wondering how someone he trusted so deeply could be so blind to the pain he carried. Each moment felt heavier than the last as he imagined his mother alone in a hospital bed waiting for him. By sunrise, his eyes were swollen, and his thoughts were tangled in grief and disbelief that Melissa still expected a celebration. She walked into the kitchen humming a pop song, completely unaware of the storm she had fueled inside him. Ethan tried once more to tell her he needed to stay near his mother, but she cut him off before he finished speaking. She rolled her eyes, claiming he was ruining everything, and acting like his mom's illness was an excuse to avoid the trip. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, and so cold that Ethan froze mid-sentence, feeling a new wave of hurt crash over him. Melissa leaned against the counter and said the words that would end everything between them without hesitation. "Stop crying about your mom's cancer, Ethan. You're messing up MY's celebration, and I won't let you drag me down." The sentence hung in the air like a slap, echoing louder than the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Ethan felt something inside him snap, a final thread that had been hanging on despite all her selfishness. He stared at her, realizing in that moment that the woman he loved had never truly cared for him at all. Her expression didn't show remorse, only irritation that he wasn't smiling or packing for the trip she wanted. He walked past her without speaking, each step feeling heavier but clearer as the decision settled in his mind. He entered their bedroom and opened the closet, pulling out her suitcase and placing it firmly on the floor. Melissa followed him, confused at first, then offended when he didn't answer her questions about what he was doing. Ethan calmly told her she needed to leave by the afternoon, and she laughed as if he was making a pathetic joke. Her laughter faded when he canceled the Miami trip on his phone and sent the refund notice to his email. She demanded an explanation, but his voice remained steady as he told her the relationship was over for good. He opened his banking app and disabled her card, knowing she would try to use it out of spite or entitlement. The shock on her face finally appeared, but it didn't soften into understanding. It sharpened into fury. She shouted that he couldn't do this to her, not before her birthday, not when she deserved a perfect weekend. Ethan didn't argue. Because nothing, she said, could change the truth he had finally allowed himself to see. He called his brother Liam, explaining everything and asking him to help pack Melissa's things before she returned. Liam arrived within an hour, bringing quiet support and a steady hand as they gathered her belongings into boxes. They placed every item neatly near the front door, labeling the boxes so there would be no accusations later. Meanwhile, Melissa paced around the apartment, threatening to cry, scream, or break something if Ethan didn't reconsider. But he no longer reacted, no longer bent, because grief had stripped away every illusion he once clung to. When the locks were changed and the spare key retrieved, Ethan finally felt the numb clarity of a man choosing peace. Melissa stood outside the doorway, shouting his name, but Ethan closed the door gently, ending the chaos she brought. In the silence that followed, he knew the hardest part wasn't letting her go. It was realizing he should have done it sooner. Melissa arrived at the airport still convinced Ethan would come crawling back before the plane departed. She strutted through the terminal with her suitcase, expecting the day to turn in her favor the moment she boarded. When she reached the check-in counter, she handed over her passport with a smug smile she didn't deserve. Seconds later, the agent frowned, typing repeatedly before informing her that the ticket had been canceled. Melissa blinked rapidly, insisting there must be a mistake because her boyfriend would never sabotage her trip. The agent repeated the information, pointing to the notification in the system confirming a cancellation and refund. Panic flickered across her face as she scrambled for her wallet to grab Ethan's credit card, only to find it declined. She tried again with the same result, the machine beeping sharply as if mocking her desperation. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, dialing Ethan with a fury that turned her voice into a shrill threat. Ethan saw the call flash on his screen, but let it ring, knowing nothing good would come from hearing her voice. She left message after message, switching between crying, cursing, and begging in a pattern that revealed her chaos. When he didn't respond, she called Liam, who instantly declined without hesitation or sympathy for her meltdown. Minutes later, Melissa's mother, Darlene, called Ethan with a tone dripping in accusation and misplaced righteousness. She claimed Ethan was heartless for abandoning her daughter and ruining a birthday trip she had been excited about. Ethan listened in silence before calmly explaining that Melissa had crossed a line no one with empathy would cross. Darlene snapped that Ethan was overreacting and needed to apologize, but he ended the call without another word. He blocked both numbers immediately, cutting off the escalating noise before it seeped deeper into his grieving mind. Meanwhile, Melissa stormed out of the terminal, dragging her suitcase with jerky motions as anger consumed her. She kept calling from unknown numbers, forcing Ethan to silence his phone completely to regain a moment of peace. By midday, she showed up outside his apartment, pounding on the door even though she no longer had a key. The new locks held firm, and Ethan refused to answer, letting her screams fade into the empty hallway. Neighbors peeked out, startled by her outburst, but Melissa didn't care about the scene she was causing. When shouting didn't work, she switched to guilt, saying she had nowhere else to go and he owed her comfort. Ethan stood on the other side of the door, steady but exhausted, realizing how deeply her entitlement ran. Eventually she left, but her mother's texts kept coming, every message accusing him of cruelty and betrayal. He blocked those too, cutting off the last thread connecting him to the chaos he had finally escaped. That evening, he sat quietly in his living room, the boxes of Melissa's belongings still lined neatly by the door. Liam checked in, asking if Ethan needed company, but Ethan said he just wanted silence for a little while. Outside, the hallway remained still, but Ethan knew the storm wasn't over yet, and Melissa wouldn't accept the ending. Her anger had morphed into obsession, and the airport humiliation only pushed her further into reckless desperation. He braced himself for whatever came next, not out of fear, but out of weary understanding of who she truly was. He knew the most dangerous moments often came after someone like Melissa realized her control had finally collapsed. Melissa returned 2 days later with a new plan, fueled by anger and the humiliation she refused to accept. Ethan had just finished a phone call with the hospital when he saw her waiting near the parking lot entrance. She stood beside 2 friends, arms crossed, wearing an expression that warned trouble long before she opened her mouth. As soon as Ethan approached his car, she rushed forward, placing herself directly in front of the bumper. Her friends followed, forming a sloppy barrier as if they expected Ethan to beg for a conversation he never wanted. He stayed inside the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, gathering enough calm to step outside. When he opened the door, Melissa immediately accused him of abandoning her, shouting loud enough to echo around the lot. Her voice cracked with rage as she claimed he was emotionally abusive and had ruined her reputation at the airport. Ethan remained firm, reminding her that the breakup was final and she had no reason to be there anymore. Melissa ignored every word, shifting into a dramatic performance that made her friends exchange uneasy glances. She marched toward the apartment building, insisting she had every right to enter because she used to live there. Ethan blocked her path, explaining the locks had been changed and her belongings were already waiting for pickup. Melissa's face twisted as she screamed that she would force her way in if he didn't hand over the new key. Her friends tried to calm her, but she pushed them aside, determined to make the moment as chaotic as possible. She accused Ethan of hiding her personal items and stealing her laptop to get revenge for their argument. Ethan repeated that everything she owned was already packed, but she lunged forward as if to shove past him. He stepped back and pulled out his phone, warning her that he would call the police if she didn't leave peacefully. Melissa dared him to do it, yelling that no officer would believe him over a crying woman claiming she'd been mistreated. Her voice cracked into fake sobs, and she clung to her friend's arm, acting as if she were terrified of Ethan. Her friends looked uncomfortable, clearly unsure whether to support her story or distance themselves from it. Ethan pressed the call button anyway, his voice steady as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. Minutes later, 2 officers arrived, approaching the scene with calm but cautious professionalism. Melissa rushed toward them first, pointing back at Ethan with trembling hands as she spun a frantic narrative. She claimed Ethan had locked her out illegally and was hiding valuable property that belonged to her. The officers asked for proof of residence, and Melissa froze, realizing she had nothing to show them. Ethan produced the lease documents, demonstrating she had never been listed as a tenant and had only stayed as a guest. One officer turned to Melissa and explained she had no legal right to enter the apartment anymore. Her expression shifted from panic to rage as she tried to argue, but the officers remained unmoved. They informed her she needed to leave the property immediately and could only retrieve items under supervision. Ethan provided the schedule Liam had created for pickup, and the officers agreed it was reasonable and fair. Melissa continued shouting until the officers warned her that she could be charged if she refused to comply. Her friends gently pulled her away, embarrassed by the scene and eager to escape the attention gathering around them. As she retreated, Melissa swore Ethan would regret everything, her voice shaking with a desperation she couldn't hide. Ethan watched quietly, knowing the encounter had only confirmed how unstable she had become. When the officers left and silence settled again, he finally exhaled, understanding this was only the beginning. Melissa returned the next afternoon with a fragile smile that barely hid the bitterness festering underneath. Ethan watched from the window as she approached the door, pretending confidence she clearly didn't feel anymore. Her steps slowed when she saw the boxes neatly arranged, each labeled to avoid another unnecessary argument. She knocked softly at first, acting polite, as if the chaos from earlier had never happened. Ethan opened the door halfway, keeping a firm but calm expression as he gestured toward her belongings. Melissa scanned the boxes, then crossed her arms tightly, claiming something important was missing from the stack. She insisted her brand-new MacBook had vanished and accused Ethan of stealing it to punish her out of spite. Ethan told her every item had been packed exactly where it belonged, and nothing had been touched or removed. Melissa raised her voice, accusing him of lying and demanding he return the laptop before she involved the police. Her tone grew sharper as she claimed the device was worth thousands and irreplaceable, pushing the lie with confidence. Ethan repeated his answer, but Melissa insisted she had proof it was left in the apartment during her last visit. As she reached for her phone to dramatize the moment, one of her friends suddenly slipped into the conversation. Without thinking, her friend mentioned that Melissa had the laptop delivered to her place to hide the purchase from Ethan. The words hung in the air, slicing through Melissa's performance like a blade in the middle of her accusation. Melissa froze, eyes widening as she realized her lie had collapsed right in front of the person she tried to manipulate. Her friend covered her mouth too late, realizing the damage was irreversible and painfully embarrassing. Ethan simply nodded, reminding Melissa that honesty would have made the situation easier for both of them. Humiliation twisted Melissa's face, and she grabbed a box with unnecessary force to distract from her exposed deceit. As she stormed out with the first load, Ethan picked up his phone, knowing the day wouldn't end quietly. That evening, he received an email from a law office claiming to represent Melissa in a growing list of grievances. The letter demanded reimbursement for the imaginary MacBook, the canceled Miami trip, and several emotional damages. It also listed a supposed heirloom sculpture Melissa claimed was priceless and accused Ethan of intentionally misplacing. Ethan remembered the item vividly, a small wooden duck she bought at a flea market for less than $40. The letter described the duck as a treasured generational artifact of cultural significance, making the claim absurd. He forwarded the email to Liam, who laughed at the dramatic wording and suggested Ethan ignore the nonsense. But Ethan saved every message, knowing Melissa's behavior was escalating into something more legally troublesome. Melissa sent follow-up emails packed with exaggerated language and threats she couldn't legally enforce. She insisted she was ready to take him to court and that he would regret not treating her with proper respect. Her desperation leaked through each line, revealing how far she was willing to stretch the truth for attention. Late that night, she sent another message accusing Ethan of destroying her life and demanding immediate compensation. He read the email once, then closed it, refusing to let her pull him into another emotional spiral. Melissa's attempts to intimidate him only strengthened his resolve to stay distant and protect his peace. He documented everything, storing every screenshot and message in a folder labeled simply, "For later." Liam reminded him that Melissa's lies were starting to crumble, and desperate people tended to make reckless choices. Ethan agreed, sensing the storm building behind Melissa's increasingly frantic attempts to regain control. As he shut down his laptop and sat in silence, he knew the legal threats were only the beginning of her unraveling. Melissa's frustration reached a boiling point the following week, and her patience snapped in a way no one expected. She showed up at her mother's house, demanding the laptop she had hidden there, convinced Ethan somehow manipulated the situation. Darlene tried to calm her down, insisting the argument had gone too far and she needed to let the breakup go. Melissa refused, shouting that everyone was against her and no one understood how cruel Ethan had been. The argument escalated quickly as Melissa tore through the living room, searching for the laptop she claimed was missing. When Darlene blocked her path and tried to take the box from her hands, Melissa shoved her in a fit of rage. The push sent Darlene stumbling against the wall, and her scream drew the attention of neighbors nearby. Within minutes, police arrived at the house after a neighbor reported a domestic disturbance involving shouting and violence. Melissa tried to explain, but the officers were already listening to Darlene describe the shove and the escalating conflict. Her story held weight, especially since Melissa's behavior was frantic and her explanations tangled in contradictions. The officers placed her in handcuffs, while she cried that everything was a misunderstanding caused by emotional stress. As she was escorted out, Melissa shouted that Ethan had ruined her life and forced her into this meltdown. Ethan heard about the incident from Liam, who received a call from a mutual acquaintance familiar with the situation. He felt a strange mixture of sadness and inevitability, knowing Melissa's anger had finally collided with real consequences. 2 weeks later, Ethan received a notice from the small claims court, informing him Melissa had formally filed a lawsuit. She demanded compensation for the canceled trip, the imaginary MacBook, emotional damages, and the so-called heirloom duck. Ethan wasn't surprised, but he gathered every screenshot, receipt, message, and photo proving her claims were fabricated. Liam helped him organize everything into a clear timeline, making sure the evidence was impossible to distort. On the day of the hearing, Melissa walked into the courtroom with exaggerated confidence, dressed as if attending a gala. She carried a stack of papers filled with dramatic statements and unverified accusations she hoped would sway the judge. When her turn came, she spoke passionately about betrayal, financial loss, and emotional devastation caused by Ethan. But each claim fell apart the moment Ethan presented concrete proof, contradicting every detail she provided. He showed the bank statements proving she never purchased a MacBook, only browsed listings without completing a sale. He handed over the flea market receipt for the wooden duck, exposing the lie about its fictional generational value. He even provided text messages in which Melissa admitted the Miami trip was for her birthday and not a shared agreement. The courtroom grew quiet as her credibility dissolved, leaving only the raw truth of her manipulative intentions. The judge looked directly at Melissa and told her the court would not tolerate false claims made out of spite or revenge. He dismissed every part of her lawsuit and issued a warning about abusing the legal system for personal vendettas. Melissa's posture collapsed, and she stared at the floor as the weight of the ruling settled over her. Ethan walked out without looking back, feeling a sense of closure he had needed for months. In the parking lot, he inhaled deeply, realizing the storm that had consumed his life was finally beginning to quiet. Melissa left the courthouse alone, burdened by fines, debts, and the consequences of decisions she refused to take responsibility for. Ethan headed home, knowing the chapter was closed and there was nothing left to salvage from the chaos she created. Ethan returned to his quiet apartment and felt a calm he had not experienced in months. He cooked a simple dinner and realized how peaceful life felt without constant conflict. Liam visited that evening and told him the worst was truly behind him now. They talked about future plans and the possibility of taking a real trip someday. Ethan admitted he finally felt free to focus on himself again. Melissa stayed silent after the court ruling and disappeared from his daily thoughts. He no longer checked his phone expecting drama or unexpected accusations. The chaos that once ruled his life faded into something distant and unimportant. Ethan spent more time with friends and rebuilt small habits he had forgotten. He woke up earlier, exercised more, and rediscovered hobbies he abandoned months before. One night, he stepped onto his balcony and looked over the quiet city lights. He felt grateful for the lesson and relieved that he chose honesty over chaos. The story with Melissa ended, not with anger, but with a quiet acceptance. Ethan closed the balcony door, ready for a new chapter with no shadows following him.